Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Micah. This is Micah's Intellectual Corner. I just wanted to first thank everybody for love and support on my very first channel. I really do appreciate that love from you guys and that support, that criticism, all that stuff. You know, helped me grow. Last time we went ahead and reacted to Oversimplified World War I Part 1. Today we're going to do Part 2. Hopefully, you know, you guys had fun with the last one. We're going to keep it a little bit light. We actually have a little bit of a new format that I want to show you guys today, but hopefully you guys like it. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump into it.
With both sides stuck in a hard stalemate, they knew this war wasn't going to be about taking territory, but about simply wearing each other down. The Allies had plenty of men to expend from its overseas dominions, and the British also started a naval blockade, so Germany couldn't import stuff, like food. Neither side really wanted a long, grueling war though, so they both thought of ways to break the deadlock on the Western Front. Idea number one, new frontiers. When the war first broke out, Australia was quick to take German New Guinea. The Allies also quickly jumped on Germany's colonies in Africa, and particularly in German East Africa, locals were enlisted as soldiers and carriers by both sides, leading to a tragic loss of life for the native Africans. Some new combatants entered the war as well. The Allies' new friends were Italy and Japan. Japan was busy building itself an empire, so it was more than happy to take away German islands and colonies in East Asia. Italy actually had an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, but after some tense relations, and then the Allies promising to give...
That's actually a good place to, I'm going to go ahead and stop it at. So just to, for Japan, just so you know, prior to this, Japan was actually going under about a 200-year period of isolation. I believe it was called Sakoku. And during this period, no Japanese citizen could leave the island under penalty of death. Only a handful of nations could even enter to do trade with the country. I think the Dutch, Chinese, and a handful of Asian countries. Only in those countries, I don't even think exist anymore. They're running like kingdoms and stuff. Those are the only ones that were able to even trade with them. It actually wasn't until mid-1800s where America, of course, came in and we essentially strong-armed them into opening back up their country through a bunch of pretty much unequal treaties and stuff like that. That actually kind of made Japan's economy a little bust, and from there, that's when we start seeing them kind of revamp their government towards more of a westernized government. Same with their military and stuff, and that's when you start seeing them really, you know, enter the imperial age of Japan that we start seeing going into the early 20th century. But
give them some of Austria-Hungary's stuff, they switched sides. Italy opened up a front in the mountains here, but like everyone else, they were stuck in stalemate for most of the war. The Central Powers' new friend was a struggling empire in the Middle East. The Ottomans were divided on whether to actually join the war or not, since they had been exhausted by the recent Balkan Wars. Some of the politicians who did want to join went off on their own and fired some shells at Russia, and then came back and said, whoops, looks like we're at war now. The Ottoman entry into the war was of particular concern to the British, since the Middle East was full of oil, and Britain wanted all of that oil. First, the Ottomans tried to attack Russia in the Caucasus Mountains, but they weren't prepared for the cold, and many of them froze to death. Then they crossed miles of desert to take the Suez Canal from the British, but that failed too. Then the Allies tried to take the Dardanelles at Gallipoli in a long and hard trench warfare campaign, but that also failed. The Ottomans blamed their initial losses on the ethnic Armenians living within Ottoman territory, and the resulting Armenian genocide led to the deaths of 1.5 million people. Then the Germans sent spies into Afghanistan to try to convince the Arab tribes there to rise up in jihad against the British and attack India. But that plan failed, partly because the spies got bored, brewed their own alcohol, and got drunk, which is a bad thing to do in Afghanistan. All these new frontiers hadn't done much to change the war. Aware that the Allies had more men and supplies than them, the Germans knew they had to do something to break the stalemate. Before the war, there was a big conference that set out the rules of modern warfare. No chemical weapons, no killing civilians. Basically, don't be jerks. The Germans held a meeting and decided to be jerks. Zeppelin air raids commenced over British cities. They also started attacking the Allied trenches with chlorine gas, and they used
Actually, a good fun fact for that. if you guys look here, in order to try to actually combat the Zeppelins that were coming in, because these Zeppelins were loud as hell. You can hear one coming up from, I think, like 3 miles out. And they're very slow. So obviously it's a hot air balloon essentially, but they'd actually make these wacky hearing aids to try to hear them up from 3 miles back to try to combat each other. It wasn't until I think obviously the Wright brothers with the airplane and the induction of the airplane into the military that kind of became obsolete, because by the time you would hear the plane coming and you would try to with the hearing aid, it would be too late. That plane would already be on top of you, or ran in hellfire. So those became obsolete pretty fast. But it's pretty interesting. I mean, just let it going though.
To sink civilian ships. One such civilian ship was the Lusitania, which had 159 Americans on board when it was sunk, further swaying U.S. opinion against the Germans. Not to be completely unfair to the Germans, the Allies also engaged in chemical warfare soon after, and they had been hiding anti-submarine weapons on their civilian ships, which let the Germans justify their attacks. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary still hadn't dealt with Serbia, so the Central Powers enlisted some help. Bulgaria wished it was bigger and was still bitter about losing the Second Balkan War. The Central Powers promised to make all of Bulgaria's wildest dreams come true if they helped, so they signed on, and together they knocked out Serbia. The Serbian troops retreated through Albania, which was neutral but had some ties to Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary entered Albania in a friendly invasion to chase down the Serbians, many of whom escaped by sea. It's 1916, and a lot is happening. As if they didn't have enough enemies already, Germany added one more to the list. Portugal had been getting a bit chummy with the Allies behind the scenes, and Germany didn't like that one bit. Around the same time, the only sea battle of the war happened. Both sides had a new powerful class of battleships called dreadnoughts, but they were so expensive to build that neither side wanted to risk losing them in a battle, so they kept them in port, except for one time when they had a big fight and a bunch of them got damaged, so they didn't try that again. The UK started conscripting men to the army, so they had plenty of reserves, which is just as well because the Western Front was about to get brutal. The longest and one of the bloodiest battles of the war started when the Germans launched an attack around the French city of Verdun. The French defended it desperately, leading to hundreds of thousands of casualties. Under pressure, the French called on its allies to do something to draw the Germans' attention away, so the British started their own long and brutal fight, the Battle of the Somme, with 60,000 British casualties on just the first day. It was also here that the British first used one crazy brand new piece of sci-fi technology. The Russians had been getting pushed back further and further.
I'm gonna stop real quick right there. Honestly, I don't think the explanation for those two battles really did justice. So real quick, just to go back on to the Battle of Verdun, I believe that one battle was fought over 10 months straight. So from February, I think, to December. So that right there was already the longest battle in the war period, and would stay that way. Would stay being the longest battle in the war. But just to have to fight for 10 months continue, because I know there had to be a few thousand people in there who just did not get changed out. The whole 10 months, just and you see why you had those pictures where people look crazy. You know what I'm saying? It's crazy. But and then you have the Battle of the Somme, which was easily the bloodiest battle of the war. Where over 1 million all together, German, French, and UK soldiers all together. There's over 1 million dead from that one battle. That only happened 4 months. That Battle of the Somme only occurred for over 4 months, and on top of that, as you heard him say, 60,000 dead within the first 24 hours. I don't think our minds really comprehends that type of number. Like, you know what I'm saying? That's a whole almost city wiped out, essentially. You know what I'm saying? That's scary to think about. And of course, as he said, also there were this is the first time we see the tank being used by the UK. Of course, the Germans had an answer for that, which was the A7V, I believe, this huge heavy tank that came out, I want to say, only a few months after the UK tank came out, and obviously it was their answer for it. Pretty scary looking. I wouldn't want to be. That looks like it's a death trap. But I thought these were really cool little things to add into it, you know what I'm saying, to expand our mind a little bit more. But hey, let's go ahead and...
But in response to the French call for help, they began a huge offensive, and did really well until they ran out of supplies and got stuck. Seeing how well the Russians had been doing, Romania decided now would be a great time to jump in and win the war. And then they got pounded. The Greeks were fighting amongst themselves about whether to join the war or not. The king liked the Central Powers, while the Prime Minister wanted to join the Allies. After a brief national schism, during which the country split into two, the king finally abdicated and the country reunited. With Allied help, they began a new offensive. In the Middle East, Russia was pushing into Ottoman territory from the north. The British had also made a landing in Mesopotamia to protect Persia's oil fields, and they had also sent a small army up the Tigris River to try to take Baghdad, but the army got sieged in the town of Kut along the way, and eventually surrendered. A new offensive was launched from the south with all-out desert warfare. The offensive was aided by one famous British officer, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, who helped lead the Arab tribes in a revolt that wreaked havoc on the Ottoman supply lines. By the time 1917 rolled around, everyone was exhausted. There were mutinies in the French army, the German populace was starving, and the war had drained all of Russia's supplies. There was no clear winner, and it was still anyone's war. The only question now was, who was going to break first? And the answer was Russia. Tired of not eating, and mad that a crazy magic homeless guy was calling some of the shots, there was an uprising in Petrograd, complete with riots.
Real quick, to even talk about Russia in this war, Russia really should not have joined this war, honestly. Because let's think about it. Going back, not even a couple of decades prior to this war, Russia's economy was primarily based on essentially farming and serfdom and such. So they didn't even start industrializing until I think the end of the 1800s, and obviously by this time it was almost about wartime, so they just were not catching up to the rest of the European powers, who by this time had already, I think, by this time had already started industrializing and making these crazy mechanical war machines essentially on mass production, where Russia just were not. The main reason why they even really stuck around, in my opinion, numbers. It had such a huge population. You guys really don't understand how big of a population this Russia really had back then. But I mean, it's really evident, especially with the Japanese-Russian war that happened just prior to this. That was proof that they just were not ready for war. And of course, being the protectorate of all Slavic nations in the Balkans. They just felt like they had to do something. Well, they probably should have waited a little bit, but what are you gonna do, right? Now they had a revolution.
And strikes. The riots turned into a full-scale revolution, and a new government overthrew the Tsar. Then a few months later, the Bolsheviks overthrew the new government, and they pulled Russia out of the war. This was great news for Germany, who now only had to focus on the Western Front. But there was still one problem. The pesky United States of America was looking increasingly like it was going to join the war. America had been selling supplies to the Allies throughout the war, and was getting super rich off the back of it, meaning it was in fantastic shape and was dangerous to the Germans. So Germany sent a telegram to Mexico saying, wouldn't it be crazy cool if you guys attacked America? But the British intercepted the message, showed it to the Americans, and that was the final straw. American troops began shipping out to Europe. This was terrible news for Germany, and they knew their only hope now was to force France and the UK to surrender before the fresh American troops arrived. It was now or never, so they started one final attack. They converged their troops and hit hard at the Somme and pushed the Allies back. They hit a second time further north, then again and again. With each hit, the Germans were spending more and more resources, while the Allies were getting better and better at repelling their attacks. By the fifth punch, the Allies held the line and even pushed back. With American troops now arriving in larger numbers, the Allies launched a counterattack, and that was it. The Central Powers were being pushed back on all fronts. Bulgaria collapsed first, followed by the Ottoman Empire, then Austria-Hungary, and finally on November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock, Germany surrendered. At the peace treaty, Germany was forced to reduce its military, accept war guilt, and pay the bill for the war. After indescribable suffering and millions dead, the world learnt its lesson and never had such an awful war again. For about 20 years.
Yeah. No. Yeah, so, I guess just to summarize up, help summarize up the video, In my opinion, I think it was kind of unfair and kind of bull, honestly, how they did Germany and the Treaty of Versailles. It is, I think, without a doubt, in my mind anyway, the number one reason why, and the lead up to World War II and the outbreak of he who shall not be named. It made the treaty made their economy horribly blessed. I mean, their Deutschmark or whatever was one Deutschmark was essentially, or $1 equaled up to 45 billion Deutschmark or something like that. That's how blessed their economy was. So you had that with everything that happened in the early 21st century, where there'd be the Depression, pretty much all that stuff. It just coalesced with that, and in my opinion, the Treaty of Versailles just exacerbated everything. But it was unfair. Why would just Germany have to take war guilt when Austria-Hungary is obviously the one who started the fight? I understand Austria-Hungary obviously lost what I'm saying, they were dissolved, they lost territory, so obviously they had the worst of what happened to Germany. But still, that wasn't Germany's fault. That was Austria-Hungary's fault. But I digress. Thank you guys for joining me on this video, Oversimplified World War I Part 2. My next video will be a science video. I would like to go ahead and try to keep it back and forth, a good mix of both. So just so you guys know, it will be interesting. It will keep you guys entertained for the next video. And I personally cannot wait to videotape it. With that being said, thank you so much for joining me, for subscribing, for liking my stuff, for being there for me essentially as I get this thing going. Yeah, so please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Thank you guys so much for all the support, all the love. With that being said, peace.